I was in my laboratory, probably talking to students. Here's a call, comes out of the blue. This young guy wanted to know if the technology was ready to be commercialized. Then he said the magic word. He says, I have access to some money that would allow us to get started. And I thought, okay. I said, where does the money originate? And he said, I'm a junior member at a venture capital firm. I went to look up what venture capital meant. I had never heard of it before.
The risks were just enormous.
They came to me with no business plan.
Willing to risk everything.
You have to be a street fighter.
We didn't know what we were doing.
Silicon Valley.
Technical breakthrough.
$100,000.
$1 million.
$10 billion.
Intel.
Apple.
Genentech.
Cisco.
Good markets.
Great companies.
Rolling companies. Sky's the limit.
The rest is history.
I don't know how to write a business plan. I can only tell you how we read them. And we start at the back. And if the numbers are big, we look at the front to see what kind of business it is.
You have to look at the way conventional wisdom works and abandon it. No one has ever accused me of underestimating myself.
Jobs and Wozniak came up to see me. Steve Jobs is a national treasure. He is so visionary and so bright. I had to fire him, though.
These men didn't always wield such influence and power. In the beginning, they barely knew what they were doing. 50 years ago, they were just young guys from modest means who thought they could help build innovative companies. This is the story of a handful of men who stirred up a revolution in finance and technology because they saw opportunity where others only saw risk.
Venture capital. I don't think I thought of it first. But I don't know anyone who used the term before I did.
Back in the spring of 1957, Arthur Rock was just a junior banker on Wall Street. But then one day, an unsolicited letter arrived at the office. The letter was unusual, and no one else at his brokerage firm knew what to do with it. It was a cry for help, and it would forever change the trajectory of Arthur Rock's life.
You gotta be lucky. Everybody's gonna be lucky at some time or another. The thing I'd say is I was lucky to be lucky early.
The letter on Arthur Rock's desk had come from 8 engineers in California, a group of brilliant young men who would soon become known as the Traitorous Eight.
We were young guys, a bunch of young engineers and scientists mostly, working together at Shockley Semiconductor.
They were having a hard time with Shockley, and they were going to leave.
Things had deteriorated at Shockley Lab. He was a very difficult person to work with, and a group of us started considering the possibility at least of leaving. So anyhow, we did write.
This prospectus is to introduce a group of senior scientists and engineers who have been working together at Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory.
Shockley had just won a Nobel Prize. It was probably a little presumptuous of us to think we could push him aside.
a group feeling arose to the effect that rather than lead one by one, we believe we are much more valuable to an employer as a group. These were, by their resumes, very superior people. And I thought, well, gee, maybe there's something here, something more valuable than just to be an employee.
That something that Arthur saw inspired him to step out of his ordinary role as a Wall Street banker.
And that's when we met Arthur Rock. Arthur came out to meet with a group of us. And Arthur said, you ought to start your own company, and we'll find financing for you.
They hadn't thought of this idea themselves.
Nobody thought of starting their own company in those days. And it was a new idea, but it was a good one.
At that time, there was no venture capital, so starting companies was new, it was innovative.
Arthur Rock had to get creative about finding capital for the Traders 8. His bank had contacts with rich families like the Rockefellers and the Whitneys, but they weren't interested in backing a startup all the way out in California.
So we made a list of companies.
In fact, we sat down with the Wall Street Journal
looking for companies to ask to invest in these 8 fellas in forming a new company.
I think we had 35 companies.
All of them said no.
The attempt to start a new company might have ended then and there, with the Traders 8 returning to their job search and Arthur Rock admitting defeat. But then, Arthur received one last lead.
We were pretty much at wit's end, and somebody suggested that I see Sherman Fairchild. Sherman Fairchild was an entrepreneur himself and also a very wealthy man. He right away saw the possibilities and decided that Fairchild Cameron Instrument would invest the $1.5 million we were looking for.
I call myself the accidental entrepreneur.
With the $1.5 million Arthur raised, the Traders 8 started Fairchild Semiconductor in Mountain View, California, a sleepy rural town 35 miles south of San Francisco. Fairchild was the first company to manufacture the sophisticated silicon chips that would power computers, rockets, and spacecraft, paving the way for the high-tech age. In time, the fruit orchards surrounding Fairchild would give way to electronics companies, and the area would become famous as the Silicon Valley.
If they hadn't stayed together and formed Fairchild Semiconductor, probably there'd be no silicon in Silicon Valley.
Arthur Rock had gotten a taste of something exciting and significant, but as it turns out, he wasn't the only one trying to figure out how to fund young companies. Just up the road from Fairchild, a handful of businessmen were experimenting with their own version of venture capital, together, around a lunch table in San Francisco.
In the 50s and 60s, there were a group of us in San Francisco that used to get interested in small high-tech companies down the peninsula. There were, I think, 5 of us in our group.
We all had jobs, but we had other time on our hands, too, and we decided we'd just put a little investment club together.
We were just a bunch of young men in San Francisco who knew each other and respected each other.
What it was like was a very close fraternity, I guess I can use that word carefully.
We have a table of 6 or 8 for lunch.
None of us had enough money to do an investment by ourselves, so we had to have help.
If one of us ran across an entrepreneur who was trying to start a company, we'd invite him up for lunch. And after lunch, we'd ask him to step out onto the street corner for a while and give us 10 minutes, and we'd make up our mind as to whether we wanted to invest in his company or not.
I don't remember that.
We didn't do that.
We were too classy to do that.
That's a little bit quick, I think. I mean, if the guy's a real nut, why you say goodbye to him without asking him to go get a cup of coffee?
Two members of the group wanted to do even more than gather around a lunch table every 6 weeks. In 1962, Pitch Johnson and Bill Draper put up all their personal savings, quit their day jobs to form a partnership, and hit the streets.
Pitch and I each got a Pontiac leased and went around and knocked on doors, and if it sounded like ABC Electronics, then we'd go in and ask the president to sit down and tell us, what do you do? Well, what do you do? Well, venture capital. What's that?
My kids would go to school. What does your dad do? My dad's a policeman. My dad's a fireman. My dad's a banker. And what does your dad do? Oh, he's a venture capitalist. Dad, what do you do, actually, We were just stumbling around trying to figure out what to do. But we just knew that if we got involved with good people in good markets, we could probably build a company.
Growing companies.
Create companies. You're helping to create something where nothing existed before. And quite a large community gets sustenance that wouldn't have existed unless you had gotten together with this entrepreneur and his team and helped him along the way.
The lunch group had established a good formula. Everyone was sharing in the profits and success of these fledgling companies. But over at Fairchild, it was a different story.
Fairchild was an imperfect vehicle. I joined Fairchild at the end of the 50s. I was not part of the Traitorous Eight. Fairchild was owned by a corporation, an Easton corporation, and the sense of division of equity was both unknown to them and repugnant to them.
All of the East Coast companies had this hierarchy, and they didn't understand about giving options to all the employees the way West Coast startups saw fit to do.
So none of the people in Fairchild, including me, had any kind of significant ownership position. So in the early 60s, people began leaving Fairchild to set up startups and to begin to participate in what people correctly realized was going to be something special.
Meanwhile, back at his desk in New York,
Well, I wanted to do more of these venture capital type deals. But the money was all in the East. And the scientists who had moved from the East to the West had all the ideas. So I saw a great opportunity in bringing the East Coast money out, backing these people on the West Coast. Go West, young man.
In 1961, Arthur Rock raised $5 million from East Coast investors and moved to San Francisco to start his own venture capital firm. He found a partner in Tommy Davis, who had been managing investments for a California oil company. Davis and Rock quickly became the biggest venture players in town, funding a series of hugely successful technology companies. And in the close-knit Silicon Valley community of the 1960s, it was only a matter of time before Arthur Rock would once again cross paths with the Traitorous Eight. Throughout the 1960s, Fairchild was bleeding talent. The lure of stock options and independence inspired many of the brilliant young engineers to peel off and start their own companies. But Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce, its two most important founders, remained loyal to their company until May of 1968, when Fairchild's East Coast management made a fatal mistake.
Noyce was the logical internal candidate to be the next CEO, but they decided they were going to look on the outside. And that changed the whole ball game. Noyce said, "I'm going to leave. Are you interested?" So I said, okay, let's do it.
They needed financing, and they called me to see whether I'd be interested. They came to me with no business plan other than what they verbally said they wanted to do.
Arthur said he needed something to talk to potential investors with.
Just to give people something.
We wrote a business plan. It was one page,
double-spaced, and that was it.
It just says we were going to make things out of silicon and some interesting electronic devices.
Oh, I said in general terms they were going to make memories.
And it has lots of typos, and I think Bob typed it himself. It's not a very profound document, but it's really kind of cute.
I said, how much money do you need? And they said $2.5 million. And I said, okay. What percentage of the company do you think you'd be happy giving up for $2.5 million? And they thought and said, well, how about half? And I said, that's fine. And within a day and a half, I had raised the $2.5 million.
Intel opened its doors in July of '68, and Arthur Rock's partnership with its founders was only just beginning.
Arthur was our chairman of the board in those days.
I spent a lot of time there. Venture capitalists do write the check, but that isn't all we do. Writing a check is easy. Yeah, it doesn't take much ink. I attended staff meetings.
Arthur asked good questions.
Was on the phone to him a lot.
An excellent board member.
Offered advice.
Planning.
Setting up an audit committee.
Customer relations.
Interviewed a lot of people.
Built all the pieces of an enterprise.
I just brought what I consider common sense to the table.
Even met his wife there. He gave us guidance on when not to go public as well as when to go public.
I was very involved in that. This was all new to Intel, but wasn't new to me.
We went public the same day that Playboy Enterprises went public. At the same price. And a few years later, one of the analysts says, the market has spoken. It's memories over memories, 10-1.
Went out on his own. Forbes profiled him in an article that caught the eye of a young investment manager in Boston.
And they said, well, now that you and Mr. Davis are doing separate things, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to find a younger partner and do it all over again. And I said, gee, I had never even, it was a light bulb. And I sat down and I wrote him a longhand letter. And I never had ever done anything like this before. Following Monday, I got a telephone call. Mr. Rock's on the line. I said, really?
Dick's letter was very intriguing. He's just generally knowledgeable and on the same piano as I was.
And I found out later that there were over 1,000 responses to the article, and that Arthur had a handwriting expert that analyzed my letter. Isn't that funny? So that's how I got in the venture business.
Well, there are no firm rules in the venture capital business, except that there are no firm rules.
Did you have any problems in convincing your colleagues?
Oh, yeah, they thought I was out of my mind on this one.
By the early 70s, inspired by the success of Arthur Rock, more members of the Lunch Group began to quit their day jobs and set up their own venture funds. Reed Dennis gave notice to his boss at American Express.
He said, "Reed, are you sure this is what you want to do?" I said, "Bill, I've never been so sure of anything in all my life." He said, "Well, we really don't want you to go, but if you're determined to go, you ought to take some of our money with you." And that's what gave us the impetus to start Institutional Venture Associates.
A career in venture capital now seemed so alluring and potentially so profitable, it was attracting people outside of finance. Two Silicon Valley engineers, Eugene Kleiner and Tom Perkins, formed what would become one of the most successful venture firms of all time.
Well, I sort of got into venture capital by the back door. I was working for the Hewlett-Packard Company when I had an idea for a radically improved kind of laser. And then I started a company to manufacture the lasers. When it was all over, I realized, gee, I had been a venture capitalist.